Hey, I'm David,
And I'm Maxine.
and we're
Scaffolded
Scaffolded Exercises.
exercises. So we're going to go sprint by sprint and kind of explain what we worked on each sprint and kind of what's important was. So in the zeroth sprint, because it's zero indexed, we just read a bunch of literature, especially in our SIG, in the rail SIG, to kind of get ourselves situated. So we read Unravel and Ply and Telescope and Isopleth just to kind of inform us where our project fell in relationship to theirs. We also did some brainstorming about possible learning interactions or coding exercises to start work on our own project. And this really helps situate us, kind of grounding our own project instead of it being kind of this amorphous idea.
For sure. Now, in the first sprint, well, actually, our second/first sprint, well, sprint one, we began to, iterate on that list of learning interactions that we could use or could, base future ideas off of. So we came up with this list of interactions that we have previously used to learn web development skills. And having that list was super helpful for us to begin thinking about the kinds of interactions that people have experience with, learning from. And it also kind of helped us think about what kind of characteristics all sorts of interactions do have in common, or at least the effective interactions do have in common, and allowed us to at least identify some type of ideal case for us to strive after for future interactions that we wanted to deal with. So that was kind of the first part of Sprint 1, and then the second part of Sprint 1 was definitely also getting up and running with different parts of technology. So we were able to reach out to Josh, who gave us updated documentation on Isopleth, and having that was super helpful just in terms of learning how to interact with existing technology, which was helpful for the status update, which Maxine was talking more about.
Yeah, so in our second sprint, we had a pretty busy second sprint. It started off with our status update, and for it, we did finally get Isopleth running with the help of Josh, which was really awesome. And what we did is we ran Isopleth on 3 pretty basic examples. We gave the result of the Isopleth graph to each member in DTR, and then after that, we asked them to recreate each example. So out of those 3 examples, we said recreate them. What we hoped to find was kind of what the difference was between Isopleth and our project Scaffolded Exercises. And what we ended up finding was a little bit different, but it was really important for us in the context of learning how to user test well. So we more found out the things that we wanted to scaffold past than the things we wanted to scaffold for. More specifically, we found things like issues with library code and setup that we're less interested in than we are about how to actually recreate the meat of a professional example. So given that it was our first real user test, it was super helpful in kind of learning how to be intentional and really think through what our study design should look like.
For sure.
The second thing that we did during the second sprint was work on our URG. We worked on our URG in 1 week. We banged it out, and it did not get accepted, but that's really okay because it really gave us a way deeper understanding of our project, and we feel like pulling from the Rail grant and from our own, beginnings testing and understanding of the project, we learned an incredible amount about, where we were situated. It also taught us a lot about how to write for research and kind of showed us the flaws in our approach in the first URG. So it was really helpful to think about research writing as more of a story than just writing information down.
For sure. So Sprint 3 comes along, and we now have, we've ran our status update, and we've collected all sorts of different videos from those who were in studio with us. And we were kind of left with so many different hours of video content to just get through. And having all that video content immediately kind of presents us with the need to synthesize all of it, or at least, a good chunk of it. So by going through all of this, all the video recordings that we did get, we kind of wanted to pay a lot of attention as to what parts of that exercise were especially difficult for folks, which definitely did provide insight or clarity, and helped us realize that we should have been scaffolding past a good number of the things that we did include in the status update. But it was still definitely, as Maxine pointed out, super helpful for us learning how to user test correctly and how improvements that we could make going forward. So the kinds of flaws that people commonly ran into that we found during synthesis was, one, the using kind of either niche or complex or maybe not as common pieces of JavaScript or jQuery code. And then additionally, just more kind of general setup things, which were kind of the class of things that we wanted to scaffold past for future tests. Also during Sprint 3, we wanted to we didn't want to stop testing by any means. So instead, we had our first kind of crack at running a study design outside of status update, and we came up with a list of things that we wanted to observe, such as kind of paying attention to how we can use different exercises and how we can order them in different ways, and how we can, I guess, what about those exercises are the most effective for people learning how to recreate different web features. And that was kind of, I guess, where we wanted to inspect or investigate the most during Sprint 3. So ultimately, out of Sprint 3, we got the short list of issues of, different kinds of obstacles that we should circumvent or find some type of solution for future versions of, for future studies. And then we also were able to, I guess, get some more kind of feedback or some more kind of clarity or direction on how to improve user studies going forward for the rest of the quarter.
Some of the additional testing that we did during Sprint 3, if you want to talk about that. This is kind of a tough thing to show. But one example of a learning interaction that we were interested in testing was Parsons problems, which basically is about reordering code in order to create like the right, you get pieces of code like this, and then you order it correctly to get the function body in the correct order.
Right, and this was actually one of the effective interactions that we did end up finding through user testing. Just the process of having some type of complex thing like a ternary operator and challenging somebody to rewrite that as being a longer kind of if-else statement forced them to think a lot more about what exactly that ternary operator was doing and how, different ways that they could manipulate it or represent it to achieve the same kind of outcome. And that was one thing that I guess most of the users, if not actually all of the users, reported a lot of, I guess, comfort, or they reported that as being kind of an element of the test that was super helpful for them, kind of understanding what exactly they were working with.
Yeah, so in the fourth sprint, we actually started to revise our URG for Weinberg resubmission. Since we're both Weinberg students, we have the opportunity to resubmit it, as long as it's before spring break, to hopefully get funding. So based on feedback from Nell, Hao Chi, and the URG office, we had a lot to work with in terms of structuring our information better. I think the biggest thing that we learned from our first writing, just beyond like how to write, was what were the biggest flaws or the biggest gaps in our canvas. And what Nell really helped us think about and talked about with us was that we were really missing our design arguments, and we didn't have a clear idea of what our design arguments really looked like or should be. So we spent a bunch of time during Sprint 4 really revising that and trying to whittle down our design argument to make most sense with what we were actually testing for and what we were actually thinking about in the minute. And this was really helpful because at this point we have our strongest design argument that we've had all quarter, and that couldn't have come from anything else other than doing a lot of reflection on our design arguments for the URG writing.
Right.
With this design argument in mind, we also started to do more user testing. So this was third round user testing. In the second round that we were just talking about, we did it on an XKCD example, which basically was like a Google Map style scrolling or like dragging element. And that's what was a professional element that we wanted to work on. That's what we use the professional code base from. So this is... it's really hard to see, but this is all the code, or the most relevant code from that interaction. And we added a bunch of new learning interactions to see how different users and different learning interactions might function. So for example, one of the things that we added was what we called the microcosm, which basically meant taking a function that called a lot of different functions and asking the users to understand each individual component function so that they could then explain the purpose of the larger function. And what we found was that the smaller we broke down the larger function, the more likely a user was able to understand the larger function. So this is just another thing that helps promote and agrees with our idea of scaffolding for understanding.
Sure. And that took us into our last sprint, Sprint 5. And our high-level objectives for Sprint 5 were just finishing the URG that we were, I think at that point, 7 drafts into, and then also synthesizing the data from our round 3 of user testing. So that's kind of where, I guess, at least we are now. We've already had, I guess, the chance to begin synthesizing most of the data that we collected from round 3. as well as like currently finishing additional drafts of the URG. But ultimately, this last week is being completely dedicated to end of quarter deliverables, of course, but also just making sure that we have at the very least we have a strong enough canvas for us to be able to present a URG that is compelling and hopefully win something. And then also just making sure that we have enough data that is synthesized so we can start next quarter off with a fresh round of testing. We want to at least be able to identify what kinds of improvements we should make with our study design for next quarter. That way then we can just go ahead and start next quarter with a fresh, user test, collect new sets of feedback, and then go from there and kind of start on a fresh foot. So those are kind of the objectives I guess we have for Sprint 5, which is over in 2 days, I think. And yeah, that was basically our quarter. How do you feel about the quarter as a whole?
I feel good about it. It was really fun to be in GTR for the first quarter. It was fun to do it with a partner, and I feel really good about the project moving forward. Hopefully, we can keep our momentum from this quarter.
For sure. That was basically everything. That was everything I was going to say, but better put. Yeah.
I think that's it.
I think that's it. Well, this is David, and
this is Maxine,
and we're Scaffolded Exercises. We'll see you guys later.